Peninsula because it's geopolitically important. Why the Soviets agreed to a division is sort of surprising. But even beyond that, this doesn't make any sense to me. We divided up Germany because they started a war. So why didn't we divide up Japan? Right? Why did we divide up Korea and not Japan? The Japanese and Russians had even fought a war in 1904 over the islands they still dispute to this day, the Northern Territories. Why didn't you divide sort of Soviets get Tokyo and the Americans get Kyoto or something like that, right? The world would be totally different. Actually, probably all of the Korean Peninsula would be communist, but you know, it's interesting to think, why did we not divide up Japan? What would the world look like if we had not divided up Korea? And it was totally imposed from the outside. That being said, it was divided, the beginning of the Cold War. The Korean War destroyed about 75% of all productive capacity on Korean Peninsula. As you know, the North Koreans invaded, went all the way down to a tiny foothold at Pusan. Then the Americans outflanked them. We went all the way up to the Yalu River. Then the Chinese intervened, and we went all the way back down again. And eventually the war stabilized exactly where it started, the 38th parallel. The American Air Force ran out of targets to bomb in North Korea. There was nothing left to bomb. And this is Seoul, which changed hands 3 times. Now, in some ways, horrific tragedy. Everybody who's Korean has a memory of the Korean War, lost a friend, lost a brother, or their family is divided. Somebody's in the north, somebody's in the south. About 2 million Koreans died, 10% of the population at the time. Right? So everybody has a story. Now, there's a lot of tragedies in the world, right? So I'm not going to say this is bigger or worse than Soviets losing 20 million in World War II, but it is a horrific tragedy to Koreans. The tragedy today is, and I'll talk about this when I talk about North Korea, we are exactly in the same place as we were in 1953. There has been almost zero change in North-South relations, US, whatever, right? We have still a divided peninsula, Cold War, et cetera, except North Korea now has a couple nukes. It's the only difference. Right? Nothing has changed basically in 60 years. Seoul, on the other hand, the benefit, and again, I would never give this as a policy prescription, have a horrible, horrific war that wipes out 10% of your population, because then you'll get to rebuild. But in fact, you did get a chance to rebuild. And what South Korea was able to do, this is the Han River, this is Seoul, and after the Korean War, basically everybody got to start over in 1950. So not just with infrastructure. Here's the Gwanghwamun with the gate again. Here's 1980. You can see there's the mountains around Seoul, some buildings, and here we are today, right? You can't even see. Somewhere over there is, downtown, right? Unrecognizable from what it was like in 1950 or 1900. So this is the benefit. Again, I'm not going to suggest countries do this, but they got a chance to start over, and it wasn't just physical. Social classes got screwed up. Everything was up for grabs. So there was no ruling class, peasants, etc. I mean, there were, but with a war and colonization and division, basically everybody got a chance to start over. So enormous transition, right? Now, during the Cold War, there were a whole bunch of military governments, coups d'etat. And in fact, no leader between 1948 and 1987, so for almost 40 years, no South Korean leader had voluntarily left office. They had all either been kicked out, assassinated, or exiled. So here's the same famous Gwanghwamun Gate, right? Military law. There was one dictator who ruled, then he got killed by his own CIA guy, and another one took over in 1979, killed about 2,000 citizens, between 500 and 2,000 of his own citizens to keep power, right? We remember Tiananmen. We don't remember Gwangju because Tiananmen's bad Chinese and Gwangju was our ally, so we sort of ignored it. These were brutal, repressive governments. By the 1980s, here's the Gwangju protest, people taking over, right? By the 1980s, there had been enough economic development, and sort of the world is changing in different ways, that South Koreans in millions began to enter the streets. And we had a very dramatic democratic transition in 1987, when the president at the time decided not to call out the troops, and he left office voluntarily. And since then, for the last 24 years, we've had, here are democracy demonstrations in 1987. And here's one thing about Koreans, which I will point out, right? This is the other side. This is not a sort of you're the king, we're the peasants, you can do whatever you want. When Koreans aren't happy with something, they let you know. which is really interesting, right? There is a deeply, I'm not going to call it democratic, but egalitarian strand in Korean society, which says, I'm as good as anybody, and it's my right to tell you what to do. And they didn't like what the government was doing, and now we have democracy today. Stable, placid. It is interesting, right? I mean, it's still evolving, and it is fun. It is fun to do this because they literally spray each other with fire hoses and beat each other up and stuff. At the same time, it's a young democracy, and we had in the United States 200 years ago we had what do you call it, duels, right? It took us a long time to get to where we are today, where even though we hate it, actually I'm not sure, I think we're going backwards right now. But I was going to say, even though you may hate the other guy, you're like my respected senator from Nebraska or whatever, right? I think but it is a democracy. There have been peaceful transfers of power despite this. There's no worry that the military is going to come out. I mean, Korea has a lot of things to be proud of. The economic development, this transition to democracy. I should put another picture on, but like people vote, right? There is a movement towards better freedom of press, freedom of speech, things like that, right? There's a lot of stuff. If you go to Korea in 1910 or 1950, you would not bet on this country having done this. There's no way, if you looked at Korea in 1950, you'd say, that's a country that's going to be an economic miracle that everybody's going to know about around the world, and is going to be a stable democracy, right? So in many ways, this is really interesting how Korea has gone. The 20th century was extraordinarily tumultuous for Korea. Colonization, division, war, military coups d'etat, up until the late 1980s. Millions of people in the street protesting for democracy. So that transition, though, Korea has managed the transition to modernity quite well, given the kinds of things it had on its plate. But you never know. Yeah, we'll talk about them. Let me just conclude very briefly, and then we can talk about whatever you want, right? So why is Korea interesting? I think there's a number of reasons beyond the fact that I happen to be Korean American and I care. First of all, North Korea remains a major international security problem for the entire region and for the United States. If North Korea was gone, the whole region would look different if that was not a problem. Obviously, the economic success and democracy in South Korea. As for your students, they're here to stay. They're not moving back. I mean, someone may, but I mean, there are, 2, 3, 4 million Korean Americans in America. And they're going to be here, right? And Koreans are very proud, passionate people. Not emotional, just passionate. So, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.